The Boldly Now Show. Burning desire. Big ideas. Bold action.
Hi, and welcome to Boldly Now. This is Michael Sean Conaway, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Forrest Landry today. He and I are going to have a conversation. I think you'll find some deep meaning and deep content in what he has to say. Forrest is a researcher, an author, a philosopher, and a systems design architect. Forrest, thank you for joining us, and welcome to Boldly Now.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Forrest, in this time, we've all had various impacts from the pandemic, from things that are, painful and tragic within our own communities and families on a global level. We've had changes in our ability to go outside of our own homes or get access to food or economics. A lot of disruption going on right now. What's going on with you? How are you doing? What is going on in your world?
Well, one of the actually beneficial outcomes, at least for me, was just that it gave me a real chance to just focus. I mean, I tend to be doing more research and on the computer and working at home anyways. So, when the stay-at-home order came in, I saw it as an opportunity to do some really good focus design work and to really drill down on the kinds of issues that COVID-19 is an example of, right? So, for example, we have these chronic situations, and how do we respond to them in a way that prevents it from becoming an acute crisis? So, in a lot of ways, kind of looking at what happened with and what is currently happening with the pandemic and such like that, has actually helped me to understand more about the work that I'm doing, and in a lot of ways, it's been, at least in that sense, something that I've been able to turn to positive outcomes, at least personally.
It's funny, like extroverts are screaming about being locked in a prison, and introverts are like, "Wow, this isn't so bad." And I could actually resonate with both. When I'm working like you, and if I'm really got my focus on something, I love the hours and hours and hours of time to stay focused. But beyond the personal, what are you seeing going on out there right now? What are the things that are kind of alarming you? Surprisingly alarming you, maybe? I think that obviously there's some alarming things going on that everybody's, clearly understanding. And then maybe what are some things that are I don't want to say hopeful, but seem like an opening out there today?
Well, one of the things that I'm finding that's really on my mind, and it's connected to this COVID-19 thing, is basically the relationship between man, machine, and nature. And so, in effect, with the virus itself, it's a manifestation of nature. So in other words, the culture is effectively having an encounter with a non-negotiable. Nature is going to do basically what it's going to do, and to some extent we have to account for that. And so in a lot of ways, when I'm looking at the long-term progression of things, and I'm trying to basically say, okay, what kinds of things are essentially going to develop a right relationship between man, machine, and nature? Then in a lot of ways, what I'm looking at is a kind of social dynamics that essentially allow for that right relationship to emerge. So in a certain sense, we can't make nature something else, right? We can try. I mean, we've obviously learned how to do a lot of things with farming and bridge construction and all sorts of stuff, but basically, the laws of physics are just going to be what they are, and so there's certain aspects of the human condition which are also going to be largely immutable, right? We're not necessarily going to change the basic conditions. But one thing we can do, which has actually been, a lot of where my emphasis has been doing is we can, there's elements of what it means to be human which are virtual, which are learned at birth, which are learned in the first, decade of one's life, and so in effect, the cultures that we live in, the kinds of systems that we manage, things like markets and how governance works, and the way culture basically helps us to have a tool set or a set of techniques for dealing with things like food and shelter and communication and stuff like that. And so in effect, when we're looking at the kind of dynamics that COVID-19 is doing, is it's revealing a profile of both what doesn't work and what could work, right? So, for instance, it's helping us to see the parts of the social dynamics, which obviously haven't been that effective at dealing with the situation. But it also gives us, in sort of reviewing and looking at these kinds of things, deeper insights into the kinds of things that could work. What would have been necessary in order to have been able to adapt to this. So, for instance, everywhere in the world, different countries have taken different approaches to, this particular pandemic. And so, in effect, we've whether people intended to or not, all of these different governments are effectively conducting experiments in the space of how governance and nature interact with one another. And so, in effect, there's actually some really interesting observations that we can make about, how culture can and cannot deal with these sorts of things, and what kinds of things we need to think about creating long-term, conscious, sustainable evolution for not only our species but ecosystems on the planet. So, in that particular sense, I find myself thinking a lot about, the ways in which, companies create, entanglements to essentially enable extraction, or the way that, there's a kind of political process that may or may not actually be facilitating conversation, or sense making that's necessary to solve problems. And so in a lot of ways, it's not just designing good sense making systems to inform choices, it's also seeing what are the cultural preconditions in which that sense-making process can exist,
right?
And to facilitate that, and one of the things that's really been exciting for me personally is that, as I've come to sort of learn the ways in which things don't work, I've also, been able to use that as a kind of litmus test to see what sort of things are needed and could work, and to effectively test out ideas. And so in a lot of ways, there's been, as I said, as I become more aware of the issues, it makes it more possible for me to be aware of the solutions. And that's actually very exciting. If I had not done as much as I had, I wouldn't have been prepared to really see those nuances and to pick out those ideas. This whole situation would have been very discouraging. But on the other hand, at this point, having worked on it a while, I've found ways to think about this that are actually seeming to work out, and that's been, at least in my personal sense of feeling and relationship to the world and the things that are going on. Even though there's a lot of stuff that for sure could be better, I personally at this point have considerable hope.
And considering that you and others have talked for a long time about some of the fragility in our system and the possibility of a pandemic, for years, how have we done? I mean, you've kind of thought about this moment coming, and obviously we're having a pandemic that's not got like a 30% mortality rate or something, completely human devastating like that. But I think because so many people right now feel like, oh my God, this is a complete disaster. Is it a complete disaster, or is it somewhere not quite that bad?
I think it's far short of a complete disaster. First of all, we have to recognize that as far as things go, I mean, in the overall schema of existential risks, or of things that could collapse civilization or cause real problems, this is basically, it's a shot across the bow. It's relatively slow moving. I mean, if we were looking at some sort of war situation, things like that, you'd have much more change happening in a much shorter period of time, and it would feel much more traumatic. All things considered, this is emerging over a period of a couple of months, and I'm living in California, and California, at least the northern parts, took a fairly aggressive approach, and I think that's worked out reasonably well. I mean, I in my circles of experience and people that I know and so on and so forth, the impact has been modest, but again, I think that the people were really pretty diligent about it. I was surprised, for example, when when the order came out to basically do shelter in place and to stay at home and stuff like that most people did. Given that there was essentially a request to shut down like half of the economy. Most business leaders and most people, workers and stuff like that, were actually quite compliant and did the things of doing that, even though it was in a lot of cases quite costly to people personally.
Hmm.
And so I think the willingness to cooperate has been demonstrated, far more profoundly than most people would really point to. And it's very easy to look at all the confrontations that occur at the margins, at the most highly placed public people, and also the people that are closest to the earth, that are the so-called out of sight rich and out of sight poor. Obviously those are very impacted in certain respects, but for the people that are adjacent to that are highly visible, it would look like there's a tremendous amount of conflict and a tremendous amount of problems and so on. But for the vast majority of what's going on in the middle, there's quite a bit of cooperation, and I think that it's very easy to overlook that. When I look at it at a national level, I have to admit I'm not that particularly impressed. But on the other hand, I didn't have that many expectations about an effective national response. I think that to some extent, we really want to recognize that necessary and sufficient to think about a good, effective response. Those are two very different orders of thinking, and they themselves are kind of different orders of thinking than say a large institution would be able to do. So in a lot of ways, I had, in thinking about institutional design and thinking about systems design and so on and so forth, had already kind of recognized that things that involve public broadcast just wouldn't be very good sense-making frameworks, and just really wouldn't be contributing to sense-making frameworks. And so to the degree that that's what most people are experiencing, they're obviously gonna have their sense-making dismayed and fragmented, and so things are going to seem a lot worse than they actually are. This isn't to say that there isn't substantial impacts. I mean, obviously on an economic level and on a social level, some of these changes are quite profound. But on the other hand, compared to some of the things that we end up thinking about far more often than maybe comfortable, this is actually, on the very low end of a lot of the things that we're concerned with.
Yeah. And yet you mentioned, sense making and some of the troubles we have with that right now. There seems like there's been for a number of years now, and maybe for much longer than I can even appreciate, maybe up to 20 years, there's been a concerted effort to dismantle trustworthy systems, or kind of who we can rely on for trustworthy information. I think first it was, intellectuals, academics, and scientists. We kind of decided to take them down, and suddenly they're no longer trustworthy. Left and right. I mean, the left has this great thing of saying, well, you're under the employ of some big business, so we can't trust you anymore. And on the right, we can't trust you because you're under the thumb or under the employ of some environmental group or whatever. We always have some way to dismantle trust in a group of people at large, which of course it's hard to have trust at a group of people at large anyway. And then most recently, I think with the rise of social media and the kind of vilification of the press, it's bewildering a little bit how little trust we can have in any information source. Do you think this is a unique period in time, or just kind of an ebb and flow in the way information happens in the public world? I mean, are we really at a bad time? It seems like it's kind of dark to me.
Yeah, there's definitely historical precedents. So for instance, if you look at the overall flow and life cycle of civilizations, when things get kind of late stage, and so we're not late stage yet, but when they start getting into the space where you're starting to look at late stages, the sort of disinformation process and the breakdown of the kind of information systems that sort of run governance system and things like that, they look like this. I mean, this is unfortunately, I have to admit that a lot of the things that we're seeing actually make sense to me in terms of a larger pattern. And there are, I think, that are unique to this situation. So there's a couple things that are obviously unique. One of them is that we have a world-spanning culture at this particular point. I mean, there's communication entanglement that involve pretty much all of the Earth. And so the sheer scope and scale of that, and the sheer involvement of that, I think has some novel features. And then technology itself as a process has obviously accelerated this in dimensions, so it's speeding up the curve on how long this progression normally takes. So on one hand, when we're looking at things like trust, and we're basically saying, okay, well, in a situation where we're no longer finding ourselves trusting the social contract, and we're no longer finding ourselves trusting institutions, and so on and so forth, then what do we trust? Where are the places that we find a capacity to build relationships that actually work. So what does trust mean? Well, a couple things that I think may be obvious to some people, but the idea is that it's not just what I can think through with clarity and logic and rigor and so on and so forth, i.e. it's got to make sense, some sort of conceptual level, correspondence of what they said and what they did and all those kinds of things. It's also got to be something that I can rely on in the sense of what I do. For instance, there's an actionable component to trust as well. So when we're looking at, can I trust this enough that when I'm basically making decisions about resource allocations, that I'm not making mistakes, and that could be time invested and things like that. That in effect what we're looking to do is be very skillful. And in a lot of ways, when we're talking about things like how to basically prepare for situations, or how to respond to things like COVID-19 and so on and so forth, we're identifying that skillfulness is not something that lives just in the individual or just in the institution, but actually needs to live in the community. And so the network of relationships that are local, i.e. your relationship with your family, your relationship with from one family to the next, your neighbors, and the people that basically live in the geographical region. Like, do we know how to actually cooperate with one another? Do we have enough skillfulness as a community to be able to respond to situations that require a response at a community level? And so in effect, when we're looking at market dynamics and political dynamics and things like that, there's this momentum to try to continually increase scale, the sort of phenomena of globalization. Well, if I can create a market that's larger, and I'm basically earning money on every transaction, I get a percentage of all of the exchanges. Of course, I want to make the market as large as possible. I want to make money move quickly. I want to make resources flow through the system so that as a result I can extract a little bit of it, right? But the idea is that when you have a situation where there's a pandemic, or where you have a situation that requires real response, again, individuals can't really do very much by themselves, and institutions aren't really positioned in a place to be able to do it because they're operating at the wrong level. They're at the level of the state. And so in effect, what we need to do is to regain and redevelop skillfulness at a community level, so that we can develop the kinds of capacities, right? If I don't have the capacity to bond, then my skillfulness is not going to help me to use and to be able to integrate trust. Right. So in other words, my capacity to trust another person is partly dependent upon my skillfulness, not just in terms of how well I can determine whether or not they're trustworthy, but how well I can integrate the actionable information and actually use that information to do things that need to be done in a coordinated way at a local level. So a lot of the things that I'm thinking about are first of all a kind of educational process where we help people to identify entrapments. We help people to identify things like cults or bad relationships, or places where their skillfulness is low and therefore failing them. Where disease and health is essentially being, disease is creeping in and health is being lost because they don't have the awareness of the kinds of preconditions that would, that they would need to be mindful of in order to adapt and to essentially be able to respond to something rather than be blindsided by it. And obviously this isn't something that a lot of people are focused on right now, but on the other hand, it is something that I'm increasingly finding to be essential for our future, both in the sense of developing, coherent visions of what it means to live in the world in a an adaptive way, and to thrive essentially. So when we're looking at creating a vision of what a community is going to be like, or what it's going to be like to live, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, and so on and so forth, what the right balance between man, machine, and nature actually looks like, and what it feels like, and how we implement that, and so on and so forth. I'm finding that a lot of our attention needs to come back to the kind of skillfulness of what it means to be a human being, what it means to have authentic relationship, what it means to be engaged in clear communication, and to have the skillfulness of those things essentially create the propensities not only to be able to live in the futures that we're describing, but also to be able to, navigate from where we are to those places.
Yeah, so there's an upgrade or an up leveling of my own competencies and capacities to make relationships, to probably have vulnerability and intimacy, to actually have an exchange of information that's more than posturing or these kinds of things.
That's
And then
precisely.
and then maybe an expansion of my consciousness, my ability to hold more than just my own concerns, hold the concerns of my neighbors, hold the concerns of my community a little bit larger.
Without putting yourself at disadvantage to do so. So, for instance, I think that one of the things people get confused by a little bit is that it's not an all or nothing thing that we're talking about here. It's not like if I basically become fully altruistic, then everything will be great. But unfortunately, when I do that, I'm not accounting for the fact of human conditions that don't change, underlying game A dynamics that effectively will co-opt well-intentioned people into things that are not very good, right? So we've seen places where good intentions aren't enough. You need a kind of competency to recognize what is the right balance, what is the wisdom that acts as a guidepost, or the principles, the sort of ways of thinking that allow us to navigate complicated social situations, complicated environmental situations, to real solutions. This is part of the sense-making process. But you alluded to it a minute ago when you were basically talking about relationships and skillfulness. If we're talking about trust, if we make an agreement, to meet at a certain time and to engage in a certain activity and so on and so forth, the strength of that agreement, whether it be a constitutional agreement or a personal agreement as to meet, such as we are, to trust those agreements, we have to look at the context in which those agreements exist, right? So if I have a business and I'm looking at the business as being like a network of agreements, sales contracts, employment contracts, tax codes, and all the rest of that stuff, or I'm in a social community and I've made agreements about who's going to wash the dishes, all of those agreements depend upon the strength of the relationships that uphold them. If I make an agreement over what we're going to do next year, but in the interim, you and I basically move to some other place, and now we never see each other anymore, then the agreement can't hold because the relationship has failed, right? So the strength of the trust that we can have in our agreements is contingent upon the strength of the relationships that we have. There's a kind of need to shift our skillfulness into how to have good relationships. But then when we look at that and we say, well, what is the strength of a relationship based on? Well, obviously there's a kind of continuity. If I see you today but I never see you again, then relationship is limited to the time that we've actually been in communication with one another. And that basically highlights that communication as a practice, as the living dynamic of our relatedness, is the basis of the relationship. So how can we communicate in a way that is beautiful, that is artful, that is clear, that is welcoming, that effectively contributes to the potentiality of the relationship in the future, as well as being dynamic in the actuality of how that relationship is now? And we can talk about principles of good communication. The notion of grant you the right to speak, right to be understood, and the right to know that you have been understood. And then when each person in a relationship grants those three rights freely and unconditionally to the other person, then communication in a genuine sense becomes possible. So, we can identify these kinds of things and begin to sort of recognize the principles and the practices that enable communities to essentially be vibrant places and to essentially thrive. And We don't have to make assumptions about, any specific technological capability. We don't have to make assumptions about, changing the basic nature of what it is to be a human. What we are doing is we're identifying capacities that are already present,
Right.
both in the nature of systems that we can build and in the nature of innate biological capacities. So, on one hand, when I was first working on these kinds of problems, I was basically saying, oh, wow, technology is pretty toxic, and humans are, they're pretty predatorial. They don't relate very well to one another. How do we create a solution in this space with these really hard problems at the boundaries? And one of the things that as I've indicating that I've come to understand and that I've come to discover is that actually there are ways to solve a problem even with those conditions, even with those stringent limits. And that's been as I've sort of describing to you some of the ways in which I'm thinking about this have opened up a lot of doors in terms of how to approach these topics, how to think about ways in which to assist communities or assist people into having the skillfulness necessary to navigate the future.
Yeah, interesting. A couple of things you provoked in my thinking there. So thinking about human beings as social animals and how, a lot of our thinking and maybe our health patterns, our body are determined by, the 5 or 10 people we're closest to, the people we spend the most time with. And then I thought, wow, if there's a network in that, when we say we're social animals, we have a network of other humans that we tend to travel with and think alike. But if you can upgrade that group of humans in any significant way, or upgrade the individual players along the way, or upgrade the connections like you were talking about now, the ability to have trust and interact. I love this notion of the right to speak, the right to be understood, and the right to know that you're understood. I think that's really beautifully put, by the way. I think it was really, really clear. We're going to hold on to that and give that to people. But you're really talking about actually affecting or impacting networks of human beings and having a way for networks of human beings to upgrade, which was really exciting to me, and I kind of get the connections around it. And then is there a technological component of that? Is there a way to track that or to monitor the health of that, or to know when our networks are not producing vibrancy and health for both ourselves and the community? I mean, it just occurs to me that there's so much that I can't see about that. I mean, I have to trust that the people I'm with are feeding me good or feeding me growth or the things that I desire. But is there another component of that? Is there a capacity that we might be able to grow as human beings to track and monitor that and maybe even develop that skill?
Well, I think so. I mean, I've at first again, looking at the balance of the relationships between man, machine, and nature, you're kind of asking, can we rely on machines to help? And to some degree we can. I think that again, there's a kind of balance between relying on machinery and systems and software and stuff like that to the degree that they compensate for our natural biases. For example, as biological creatures, we have a long evolutionary history, some of which was written in to basically deal with circumstances that were very important for us to be able to deal with at the time. Obviously, in our current circumstances, some of those situations aren't as adaptive as they could be. So, in effect, we can sometimes, in judicious ways, use technology as a kind of balancing point to compensate for psychological and sociological bias. So, in effect, there's a strengthening capacity that can be created. But on the other hand, if we create too much dependence on that, then there's a kind of weakness. You end up with a way for people who are developers to essentially basically bound by macroeconomic process, be compelled to create systems that entrap people, and that the cell phones and all the rest of the software all of a sudden becomes more of an addiction rather than an actual assistance. So instead of helping us to cope with our biases, they're in a sense feeding on them.
Yeah.
And so if we don't recognize where things like that are happening, then we actually weaken ourselves. We weaken our capacities, and it doesn't take very long before things start going seriously wrong. Tristan Harris spoke to this in some of his more recent, well, I'm thinking over December, January period, where was talking about it's not so much that AI is a risk when it gets more intelligent than humans. It becomes a risk when it basically surpasses our weakness, when it passes the threshold of it's able to basically disable us. Then it doesn't necessarily need to be more powerful than us. It only needs to be able to cater to our weaknesses, essentially, to become a real issue. And that threshold has been passed. So in a certain sense, when we're looking at technology and its use and things like that, I tend to basically say there is a lot of potential here, but in order to take advantage of that potential, we have to change the environment in which that technology is being used. We have to change some of our concepts as to what that actually means.
Yeah.
There's kind of this broad spread assumption that we build technology for ourselves. That we build these machines, and that these machines are meant to be in service to the humans that built them. And that's just not actually the case. We are needing to build technology that is in service to nature, so that nature has the capacity to provide an environment and an ecosystem that we can live in. So, in effect, we can't do it directly with machinery. We have to do it in cooperation with nature. To some extent, machine needs to serve nature. And so there's again, a whole different dynamic here. People more or less assume that they can just have someone else deal with the programming and create the systems and the policies and the laws on their behalf. So we've crafted these representative systems and so on and so forth. And at this particular point, I'm basically saying, no, if there's actually going to be government for the people, by the people, of the people, we need to embody that in the sense that the people that are working in the community need to understand how this code works. They need to understand the machines that they're building and to know specifically that they're genuinely in service to their strengths rather than to their weaknesses, that they're genuinely contributing to health rather than not. And so, on one hand, you asked, can we use machinery to identify health? And yes, we can. But it's more a question of, can we think about what health means well enough so that we can know that the machinery is actually helping us to identify genuine health? Yeah. It's not necessarily going to be like a number on a dashboard. It's going to be more like a series of threshold conditions that basically say, all of these things need to be true. And if any of them are not true, something is probably wrong and we need to start doing diagnosis.
Yeah.
So, if people start coughing a lot, or they start getting sick, or we find ourselves having to deal with acute situations all of the time, and we're no longer ever thinking about chronic problems, then there's essentially a lack of resilience. There's a lack of health.
Yeah.
And so, in effect, I don't want to get caught up in the problem of developing the dashboard while the rest of us are basically dying. Yeah. So in a sense, there's a real need to understand the notion of appropriate technology and what the relationship, again, between man and machine and nature, in a genuine, healthy, ecological sense, actually looks like. Which is a part of going back to the question you sort of started with, which was, what does it mean to basically create a thriving community, or what does it mean to live in a world that's worth living in 100 years from now?
Yeah, a couple of things I want to just bookmark there. One of the things you said is when the machines cater to our weakness, and so I want to so we're flipping to that social feed because we're lonely. That's catering to weakness.
That's right.
It is not actually making us more connected, more vulnerability here, more intimacy there, more fulfillment. It is literally just keeping us in the weak state so we continue to consume. I want to just make sure that people understand that as a notion. And then the other notion is that optimization problem. We've been optimizing for wealth extraction or money extraction, and money is an abstract notion, but we can measure people's attention, for example, in the social media economy, and that turns into wealth. So they're extracting our time and attention for wealth, and that's an optimization. That's what our economy gives incentives for is optimizing around those routes. In order to actually imagine a different kind of optimization, it has nothing to do with the machines. It has to do with humans and culture. We have to decide that a different kind of optimization is what's required, and then require that in our commons, which may be a digital commons, that people behave in accordance to whatever we think is needs to be optimized for, and that's a big deal. It's not just a matter of a bunch of coders sitting down and figuring out how to do something. It's having a bunch of human beings sitting around and deciding, wow, wealth extraction or turning natural resources and human resources into wealth is not what we want to optimize our society or civilization for. Then we got to choose something else, and it seems like that's one of the more daunting.
Well, that's kind of what's really interesting about this. And so, at first, if we basically say, okay, what happened here? Well, because of market processes, we ended up optimizing for wealth creation. Well, what was it that caused that to happen? I mean, what is the preconditions that is the privatization of wealth that people are seeking? Well, you can go back to biological preconditions and propensities that individuals have. I mean, if we're looking at things from a survival point of view, it's actually pretty straightforward to develop the sufficient capacities to continue to survive. But if you're looking at family selection processes, mate selection kinds of things, then it's a relative comparison that's being made, and so in effect you end up with people optimizing for prestige or status or the kinds of things that will differentially show them as being preferable to the neighbor, so to speak. And in a lot of ways we are kind of unconscious about our own fundamental natures, and that unconsciousness of our own fundamental natures is leading us into behavior patterns that collectively are creating short-term wins for some number of people, right? So we start getting really good at playing these games, what we call game A, and some people are winners and other people are losers, and this sort of inequality thing shows up, and the people that are really good players optimize for playing better, and they get this sort of exaggerated advantage, but their sense-making capacity, because they don't really understand themselves or the world that they're working in very well, hasn't actually gotten any better, so they end up making poor choices, and resources are squandered, and then eventually the system crashes. So, we could go back and say, well, inequality is the problem. When you have substantial inequality, you don't have enough information flowing through the system in the appropriate ways, make good choices, sense-making gets degraded, but wisdom necessary to do that sense-making was already essentially chosen against, because the wisdom started in the space of literally understanding what the real problem is. So, yeah, on one level we can say inequality basically drives civilization collapse, and that market systems basically don't have the capacity to think long term. They're very feedback oriented. They're short term responsive. You mentioned trying to get people to think long term, and I completely agree. Right. So in effect, what we're observing here is that neither governance in the usual sense nor market process in the usual sense, in the first case because of politics, in the second case because of quarterly yields, can really think long term. Like neither of those are forums in which long term thinking, responsive thinking, health oriented thinking, or adaptiveness, or community process support, or any of that other kind of stuff can't really occur in those contexts. And so, and the reason for that is because we, a lot of times, even in our thinking about these things, we're still looking for a quick fix. But the problem is more in the space of our understanding of our fundamental natures, our understanding of what it looks like when a person is caught in the habit, much like any other addiction, caught in the habit of creating something that is designed to entrap other people to be able to charge rent over long term. So you have honeypot seeking or honeypot creation. I'm going to create this beautiful device, and I'm going to give it all sorts of features, and then the next phase would be sort of this entrapment kind of thing, where first you entangle them, You say, well, in order to have that, you have to give us your credit card. You also got to give us all of your personal information. And once we have your network of social network and so on and so forth, then we can go into, well, actually, running this thing is really expensive, and we're going to need to raise the rent that we're charging you to use this service. And so, in effect, without some sort of compulsion in the middle, without some sort of honeypot to drive it, you don't get the extortion capacity at the end. So, in effect, we as a culture, we'll spend a whole bunch of time in school, grade school, high school, college, professional degrees, and so on, teaching people how to get better and better at making addictive systems, get better and better creating entrapment scenarios, how to get ahead as an academic, or how to get ahead as a CEO, or how to basically play the game better. But at some point or another, when things start breaking down, a few of us start looking at, is this the right game to play at all?
Right.
People sometimes ask me, what would be a good book to read, and I've come to start habitually recommending this thing called Finite and Infinite Games by James P. Carse. Right? Finite games played to win, but an infinite game is played to continue playing. And so when you recognize that game A just isn't the right game, and the game theory itself has certain assumptions built into it that fundamentally preclude any possibility of understanding or recognizing what a solution even looks like. When you recognize that even the notion of game theory, the way it's currently conceived, fundamentally the problem, right? That in effect we need to upgrade the tools with which we are regarding the sense-making process, the tools with which we recognize what the sensibilities are behind skillfulness and beauty and goodness and meaningfulness really are. I've had the fortune, very, very good fortune. I spent the first part of my life basically thinking a lot about metaphysics, which is basically asking a what question. Science and technology are basically answers to a why question. Why does this happen? So causal theories and mathematics are very, very good methods of working with, obviously, science and technology, because they have that sort of structure built into them. But if you're wanting to answer, questions like, well, what is the fundamental nature of time? Or, all of the things that physics basically takes for granted, such as, what is space and what is matter? And, we can talk about how those things relate, or why they relate in that particular way, but just getting down to the nature of the isness of it, right? The ontology and the epistemology. And again, these things seem like really, really abstract concepts, but what it does is it gives you a tool set to think about things like ethics, about what meaning means, about what value and purpose really are, about what is beauty and the fundamental nature of a good choice. Right? So if we're trying to develop skillfulness, the ability to make better choices in situation, a very practical, fundamental kind of thing. So I find myself oftentimes wanting to have a real a real sense of connectedness, not just with myself, but with the world and with other people. There's a skillfulness, an availability, and a willingness to make that happen. And so, in effect, what the metaphysics does is it gives you a way of genuinely, deeply understanding the nature of the relationships behind choices, the nature of the relationships behind skillfulness. And so, having that tool set, I've been able to see things in a way that is somewhat deeper and somewhat more tuned to the nature of the unique problems that are facing us as a species. And so in that particular sense, while on some respects it's like, wow, there's this really abstract set of tools, found a way to bring them into genuine practice in a way that matters to real people in real time. And that's been actually quite satisfying. It's been very beautiful to experience that, because I think that in some respects, I for longest time, for a couple decades, had really even thought that I'd ever see any of this happen in my lifetime.
Right.
So I'm in effect beginning to witness, basically these concepts and these ideas begin to be deployed in practice to real and necessary effect.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'd recommend you pick up James Carson's book, Finite and Infinite Games. And if you're going to pick it up, you might as well just go ahead and get 10 copies. And honestly, if you can make it through the first 34 pages, you can kind of have your mind blown by that. I mean, there's a bunch of social psychology stuff in the middle of the book and really kind of deep thinking. But yeah, keep a stack of them and hand them out. It's kind of to me, I think it's one of the fundamental texts of the shift in mindset that even gives you a possibility to have the panorama to understand that we could create an underlying, game structure, or underlying way of interacting with each other that is mutually beneficial in every condition. And that, that book and James, who I've been in contact with some over the past couple of years. Yeah, I mean, it's access. It's like one of those golden doorways into, oh, that's how I meant to be thinking about that. That's how I meant to say it. And then, I think, when you start, like we just started going off into that territory, which I think is so important for humanity to kind of a little bit more en masse grab a hold of. And that's, deciding that, even distinguishing the difference between epistemology and ontology, to get their hands wrapped around a little bit of what is a phenomenological experience, where is my experience in this? And, these are upgrades in consciousness that are not new for human beings. It is, we can trace the roots, all of these conversations back to the age of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, when they were trying to grapple with the basic nature of reality as a conversation. And it still seems that the pace of the development of our physical, structural society has outpaced our capacity to keep up in a cultural and, I want to say intellectual, because it really does start with thinking, but it is also relational and emotionally centered capacity. And I think a little bit of what we're doing here is to try to catch up. It's not like this, like I said, like this thinking is new. It's just how do we get it to be part of the structure and warp and weave of daily life. And in those regards, I want to thank you for, you're doing the thinking, but you're also doing the design work. You're also thinking about the applications of these things. And that's a bit of a rare breed, to both be able to think about deeply and to, create designs and things like that. So I really appreciate that.
It's actually quite satisfying. I at this point have, like I said, it's genuinely pleasurable to have an idea. And then that same day, you wake up and you're inspired. You have this thing you just figured out how to do. Then literally to be able to walk into a shop that's your own, that's prepared for you, and to build something and to try that idea out, right? To basically find out, within a few hours, if you're skillful enough and have the resources to make something, to basically test a concept.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, I find myself at this juncture feeling quite privileged to be able to, think about it and bring it to practice, to have, on one hand, a seat at the table to even be in the conversation, to be talking to you like this. And then at the same time, to be able to experience it in some embodied and manifest way. Obviously at this point, the limiting factors are not so much what's going on in the conceptual space. It's more in the embedding space. It's how do we bring these ideas into practice in a way that many people can relate to and actually begin to use. And so, like for instance, going back to the James P. Carson thing. The end result of reading that book is the recognition of the difference between game A and game B.
Yeah.
Right. So, what he's calling infinite games, a lot of people have taken to calling game B. But, then the next layer, the next level is essentially becoming skillful at recognizing the kinds of entrapments, the sheer variety of entanglements that people are creating, and noticing in ourselves the habit of creating those same entanglements, the sort of, the pain of loss of community process as manifest in the and the notions of how one proceeds. So, like in the United States, for example, there's this thing, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It sounds great on the surface until, people start pointing out that level of individualism, if taken too far, can create some real harm. We have so much privatization of value and so much extraction going on. There's so much parasitic process. So much of that has resulted in such a level of inequality that the world is suffering. But at the same time, when we look at, well, where did that come from? What is that about? And we see, substantial abuses of collective action. So, for instance, you have institutions, you have some petty dictator or king or whatever, and they basically, the notion of the social contract is that they are, their charter is to protect the land and the people, right? That's what a government's supposed to do. That's the fundamental trust of any representative system. And time and time again, we see that a lot of times that the people that are in positions of power, are corrupt in this. They're using that power to their own ends rather than actually protecting the land and the people. So on one hand, we can look at this COVID-19 thing, and we can basically say, okay, to what degree did the federal government protect the land and the people? Well, actually, not at all. I mean, just flat out. I mean, like fundamentally. So I'm just basically making an observation here. I'm not trying to condemn them or anything. I'm basically saying they were incapable of doing something about this solution before it happened. The thing is that to some extent, our assumption that representative system would be able to do anything else was probably needing to be questioned, right? And so, in effect, we now come back to, okay, well, how do we recognize the habits that we all have growing up in this civilization? Just do things the same way it's always been done, which are no longer working for us. What got us here, what got us from the past to the present, will not get us from the present into the future. There's a shift that is needed. And the shift isn't the kind of shift that's basically going to happen because somebody invented a warp drive. It's not going to happen because somebody figured out how to rewrite the entire genetic code of a human being and make them into some sort of God. It's going to be because we understand ourselves, we understand nature, and we understand machinery, basically, with enough compassion, with enough skillfulness, with enough recognition of the things that actually matter, that we can begin to embody that meaningfulness in a first-hand sense rather than some abstract way. And so, right now we are so deeply mired in the habits of, well, we create representative systems and then we vote, and that's the sense-making we do to solve policy problems. And, we all just basically put up with it because we don't have a better way, right? I think Churchill was the one who said something along the lines of, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. So in effect, for like 1,000 years, nobody has thought of a better way to do this. Well, partly it's because they didn't have the tools necessary to even be able to have the conversation to really think about it. So on one hand, while we can go back to Plato and Aristotle and great thinkers out of other traditions, Eastern philosophies and so on, that have really contributed a lot of value to this conversation, we need to recognize that there is a set of tools that we've only recently acquired as a species that allows us to now have a set of conversations that have never happened before, that effectively upgrade our capacity to think about what it means to be in good governance. And that by using those tools, we now begin to start answering questions that we've never been able to answer in a satisfactory way. Like, what would be a substantially better way of thinking about all of these problems than anyone has ever done? Like orders of magnitude better. Right? We're not talking incrementally better. Okay, we've come up with a slightly better way of voting. We're going to do quadratic voting, or we're going to do runoff, or something like that. Those are incremental changes. They don't reflect the level of deep thinking that's necessary to solve the genuine problems that we're now faced with. So part of it is that I'm basically, through the proxy of other people, trying to provide a sense of educational methodology so that we can begin to speak a language that has the capacity to hold the solution within it. And that by effectively having that perception of what the problem is and what the solution is, what characteristics the solution would need to have, that we can begin to recognize the solution. And you know, that starts on a personal level. It starts on a small community level. It becomes essentially a kind of almost monastic discipline, but it's not religious.
Right.
And so in effect, there's just, for what I'm essentially experiencing is this huge panoply of ingredients. And now I can sort of see the constellation of the ingredients, and I'm beginning to sort of say, okay, well, if we take that piece and we combine it with this one, we'll end up with something that can engage with this, which can connect with that. And before long, we can then start to have a conversation that is generative, genuinely generative. And so in that particular sense, you know, it begins with a kind of re-understanding of the world in which we live in, a re-understanding of what it means to be human, or what it means to be in a healthy relationship, or what an ecosystem genuinely is. And so, you know, in those, and I'm referring to those concepts, but I'm not trying to draw on the left way of thinking about them or the right way of thinking about them. I'm just trying to give a pointer, the direction that needed to go in order to address this. So the finite and infinite games is like a doorway. If you can walk through that, then at least you know that there's a bifurcating path. And then if you get through that doorway, we need to become wiser about the nature of ourselves, so we can be recognizing the way in which other people are oftentimes in self-deceit, and therefore not only deceiving themselves, but also deceiving us. So to see clearly, to move beyond the desire for either using complexity to solve complexity problems or simplicity to basically be a reaction to that, move into genuine clarity. And from that place, then we can begin to walk in a way that matters.
Wow, I think that sums it up for me. Wow. Forrest, thank you for this time. You know, in this moment, you know, many people are open to looking for new solutions in a way they've not been before. And I don't know if that means they're open enough that we see some kind of radical shifts in our society and culture, but I do think an opening is an opening. And we're very interested in you know, shoving that door as wide open as we can in the time that we have to do that. Disruption is always a friend of change. Now, it's a friend of other kinds of changes that we'd actually not like to have visit. You know, there's certainly nationalistic and totalitarian impulses out there that I'm sure are really excited about this moment as well. But thank you for your thinking and your words today. I'm very, very pleased to have had this conversation with you, and I'm going to walk away enriched. I've got lots of things to think about and mull myself, and I'm sure they'll come to completion. We'll have another conversation soon.
The Boldly Now Show, igniting the world of burning desire, big ideas, and bold action.